The rising tide of alliances. 6 years had passed since the last time Donald Trump had walked on Japanese soil as a sitting U.S. president. The air in Tokyo was thick with anticipation. Streets were lined with American and Japanese flags fluttering side by side, and the distant echo of rehearsed drumbeats rolled across the Imperial Plaza. When Trump's motorcade finally arrived, a military honor guard stood at attention, a symbol of tradition and tension combined. This visit was more than ceremonial. Behind the crisp uniforms and polished speeches lay a quiet urgency. Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, newly emboldened yet politically cornered, was walking a delicate line between reassurance and realism. She was expected to greet Trump not merely as an ally, but as a partner in a shifting world order. Takaichi's government had already pledged billions in new investment deals with U.S. companies. But those numbers, though impressive, were only the surface. Trump wanted more than economic promises. He wanted proof of loyalty, proof of strength. And Takaichi, standing in front of her nation's flag, knew exactly what that meant. Just days before the meeting, she had stood before Japan's parliament, declaring plans to accelerate the nation's largest defense buildup since World War II. The security of our people, she had told lawmakers, depends not on hope, but on preparedness. Her words were firm, but behind them was a reality few could ignore. Japan was rearming not merely out of pride, but necessity. Across the East China Sea, China's military presence had grown increasingly assertive, testing Japan's maritime borders and airspace with a regularity that was once unthinkable. In Washington, policymakers viewed Japan as a frontline ally, a partner crucial to countering Beijing's expanding influence. Trump, however, saw it in starker terms. During his first presidency, he had often complained that Tokyo wasn't spending enough on its own defense, accusing it of relying too heavily on American protection. Now, with his return to power, the same expectation had resurfaced, only louder, sharper, and more transactional. The Japanese public was divided. For decades, their post-war constitution had limited the nation's military capabilities, embedding a pacifist identity deep in its political culture. But with China rising and North Korea's missile tests increasing, sentiment was slowly shifting. Polls showed that while many still opposed full militarization, a growing number supported Takaichi's plan to raise defense spending to 2% of Japan's GDP, aligning it with NATO standards. That pledge, though significant, might still fall short of what Trump demanded. As one senior official confided to the Yomiuri Shimbun, the Americans want Japan to go beyond symbolism. They want hardware, strategy, and commitment. Yet Takaichi faced a domestic constraint. Her ruling coalition lacked a firm majority in the Diet. Even as she sought to project strength abroad, her ability to pass sweeping military reforms at home remained uncertain. Still, the optics mattered. The honor guard, the ceremonial speeches, and the joint statements of shared values were all pieces of a delicate diplomatic choreography, one that would be closely watched not just in Washington and Beijing, but across the entire Indo-Pacific. Trump's visit came at a time when the balance of power in Asia was being redrawn. The Pacific was no longer a distant theater, it was the front line of economic and strategic competition. For both leaders, the stakes could not have been higher. As Air Force One lifted off from Haneda Airport 2 days later, Trump's next destination loomed on the horizon, Gyeongju, South Korea. There, another set of challenges awaited him, and another ally expected reassurance. But for Japan, the echoes of the visit would linger long after the motorcade disappeared. The promise of a stronger partnership had been made, but whether that promise could survive political reality was another matter entirely. Asia. By the time Trump's plane landed in Gyeongju, the mood in East Asia had shifted from ceremonial optimism to cautious watchfulness. The American president was moving through the region like a chess player advancing across a volatile board, one move at a time, each calculated to send a message to both friends and rivals. In South Korea, he was scheduled to meet President Lee Jae-myung, a leader balancing between Washington's demands and Seoul's desire for peace with the North. The two men shook hands before an array of cameras, but behind closed doors, the conversation was less about peace and more about power. Trump's upcoming meeting with China's President Xi Jinping, scheduled for Thursday, loomed like a storm cloud over every conversation. The United States and China had just imposed new rounds of tariffs on each other's exports, the latest escalation in an economic war that had stretched across 2 presidencies. Washington had targeted Chinese electric vehicles and semiconductor components. Beijing retaliated by restricting exports of critical minerals essential for Western technology industries. Both sides spoke of national security, but everyone knew what it really was, a struggle for dominance in the 21st century. Neither Washington nor Beijing expected a breakthrough in the talks. Restoring the trade terms that had existed before Trump's return to power was not on the table. Instead, negotiators were focused on preventing further collapse, a fragile truce in a rivalry that neither side could afford to lose. As one White House advisor put it bluntly, the goal is not peace. The goal is control. Meanwhile, Tokyo was watching closely. For Japan, any shift in U.S.-China relations could append its own carefully calibrated strategy. Takaichi's government needed America's military support to deter China, yet it also relied on Chinese markets for economic growth. It was a balancing act played on a razor's edge. In private briefings, Japanese diplomats expressed unease over Trump's unpredictable negotiating style. He admires strength, one diplomat said, but he defines it in his own terms. For Takaichi, that meant walking into every meeting ready to make concessions, but never appearing weak. Her advisors were already preparing for Trump's visit to Beijing early next year. Between now and then, Japan's role would be to keep communication open, avoid provocation, and quietly strengthen its defense infrastructure. In Tokyo's strategic circles, the phrase quiet power had become a mantra, influence exercised not through confrontation, but through persistence. Yet outside the corridors of power, public opinion was less restrained. Demonstrators had gathered outside the U.S. Embassy during Trump's visit, holding signs that read, "Peace, not provocation," and "No more wars." Older citizens remembered the devastation of the last global conflict. Younger activists feared the cost of being drawn into another one. Still, the momentum toward militarization seemed unstoppable. Japanese shipyards were already building new destroyers, and defense contractors were in talks to co-develop hypersonic systems with U.S. firms. The government framed it all as self-defense modernization, but the implications were far greater. Across the sea, China's state media denounced Japan's rearmament as a return to militarism. The rhetoric was familiar, but this time it carried a sharper edge. In Beijing's view, Japan's growing alliance with Trump's America was part of a larger encirclement strategy. And in Washington, hawks applauded the shift. Japan is finally waking up, one U.S. senator declared. They're realizing that freedom isn't free. As the week drew to a close, Trump's entourage prepared to fly onward to China. The meetings in Tokyo and Gyeongju had set the tone, one of tension managed, not resolved. Each leader had played their part in a regional drama defined by ambition and caution in equal measure. For Takaichi, the challenge was just beginning. Her promise to strengthen Japan's defense had bought her time, but not certainty. Domestic opposition, economic pressures, and the unpredictable moods of her American ally would all test her leadership in the months ahead. And somewhere beyond the diplomatic statements and military parades, the people of Japan continued their daily lives, watching, waiting, and wondering if the peace their nation had cherished for nearly 8 decades could survive the gathering storm.